After 42 years of marriage, Thomas Mitchell knew what it felt like to lose the love of your life while she was still breathing. Every evening, the 67-year-old nurse walked through St. Mary's Hospital parking lot with shoulders that carried more than just the weight of another long shift. His wife had been in a coma for 3 months. Each day, he hoped she would wake up. Each night, he went home alone to an empty house that still smelled like her perfume. That Tuesday evening, as his tired hand reached for his car door, a little girl's scream cut through the quiet air. 6-year-old. Layla ran from the hospital crying and shouting something that made no sense. "Don't get in the car! Please don't get in the car!" Most people would have dismissed it as childish hysteria, but something in her desperate eyes stopped him cold. What could a little girl possibly know about the tragedy that was about to unfold? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Mitchell stopped walking, something in the child's voice. A raw terror that cut through the evening air like a blade made him pause with his hand still reaching for the door handle. The little girl stood maybe 20 feet away, her small chest heaving with sobs, her dark eyes wide with a fear that seemed too deep for someone so young. "Honey, what's wrong?" Thomas asked gently, his nurse's instincts kicking in despite his exhaustion. He'd spent 43 years in hospitals, the last 2 decades here at St. Mary's, and he'd learned to read the difference between ordinary childhood upset and something more serious. This was something more serious. The child, who couldn't be more than 6 or 7, wiped her nose with the back of her hand and took a shaky step toward him. "Please, mister, don't get in your car. Something bad is going to happen." Thomas glanced at his modest sedan, then back at the girl. In the fading daylight, he could see she was well-dressed, clean, obviously cared for. Not a street child or someone in immediate danger, but her fear was real enough to make his chest tighten with concern. "What kind of bad thing, sweetheart?" Before she could answer, a woman's voice called from the hospital entrance. "Layla, Layla, where are you?" The girl, Layla, turned toward the voice but didn't move away from Thomas. A woman in her 30s hurried across the parking lot, her expression mixing relief with embarrassment. She had the same warm brown skin as the child, the same expressive eyes, though hers held worry rather than terror. "I'm so sorry," the woman said as she reached them, placing a protective hand on Layla's shoulder. "She just ran out of nowhere. Layla, you can't just take off like that." "This is your daughter?" Thomas asked. "My niece. I'm Rosa Herrera. We're visiting my sister. She's having some tests done." Rosa looked down at Layla with a mixture of love and exasperation. "Layla has a very active imagination sometimes." She seemed concerned about "My car," Thomas said carefully, studying the child's face. Layla was staring at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. It was the kind of look he'd seen in his patients' family members, people who were trying to communicate something, vital but couldn't find the words. "It's going to fall," Layla whispered. "What's going to fall, honey?" She pointed upward, and Thomas followed her gaze. Above the parking lot, silhouetted against the darkening sky, stood a construction crane. St. Mary's had been expanding their cardiac wing for the past 6 months, and the towering machine had become as familiar as the hospital's own spires. Thomas had parked in its shadow hundreds of times. "The big arm thing," Layla said. "It's going to fall right where your car is." Rosa laughed nervously. "She's been fascinated by the construction equipment. I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell, Thomas Mitchell." He was still looking up at the crane, noting how it swayed slightly in the evening breeze. These machines were built to withstand much more than a little wind. Still, something made him take a step back from his car. "Mr. Mitchell, I work here too. I'm a nurse on the 4th floor. I've seen you around, I think. You work nights in ICU?" I did, Thomas said absently, his attention divided between the conversation and Layla's unwavering stare. Actually, I just retired last month. I only come in now to visit my wife. He felt the familiar tightness in his throat at the mention of Margaret, but pushed through it. She's in the extended care unit. Rosa's expression softened immediately. I'm so sorry. That must be incredibly difficult. Thomas nodded, fingering the small object on his keychain. Margaret's wedding ring, which he'd moved there after her fingers had grown too swollen to wear it. The doctors had said the swelling was normal, just another sign that her body was shutting down slowly, but Thomas preferred to think of it as temporary. Everything about Margaret's condition was temporary, had to be temporary. Mr. Layla said urgently, tugging on his sleeve, "You need to move away from your car, right now." There was something in her voice, a certainty that cut through his rational mind. Thomas had spent his entire career trusting his instincts, learning to read the subtle signs that separated life from death, recovery from decline. Those instincts had never failed him in a medical setting, and something about this child's conviction spoke to the same part of his brain. He took several steps back from his car, pulling his keys from his pocket. "Okay, sweetheart, I'm moving." Rosa looked embarrassed. "You don't have to humor her, Mr. Mitchell. Layla, we need to get back inside to check on Aunt Carmen." But Thomas was studying the crane more carefully now, and he noticed something he'd missed before. One of the support cables seemed to be swaying differently than the others, and there was a faint groaning sound carrying on the wind. Or maybe he was imagining it. "Has she ever—" Thomas began, then stopped. He was about to ask if Layla had ever predicted things before, which was ridiculous. She was 6 years old. The groaning sound got louder. Thomas grabbed Rosa's arm and pulled both her and Layla further back, just as a sharp crack echoed across the parking lot. The crane's main arm, a massive steel beam that had been reaching out over the construction site, suddenly tilted at an impossible angle. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, it hung suspended against the sky. Then it fell. The impact when it hit the asphalt was like thunder, sending vibrations through the ground that Thomas felt in his bones. Metal screamed against concrete. As the massive arm crushed not just Thomas's modest sedan, but 2 other cars parked nearby. Glass exploded in shimmering cascades, car alarms began their discordant wailing, and somewhere in the distance, people started shouting. Thomas stared at the wreckage where his car had been, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The crane arm lay across 3 parking spaces like a fallen giant, twisted metal and shattered glass, glittering under the parking lot lights that had just flickered on. "Jesus," Rosa whispered, her hand tight on Layla's shoulder. "Oh my God, if you had been—" Thomas looked down at Layla, who was no longer crying. Her expression had changed to something almost like relief, as if a terrible weight had been lifted from her small shoulders. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. Layla looked up at him with those serious dark eyes. "The lady told me." "What lady?" "The lady with the kind eyes. She said you were very sad, and if something bad happened to you, you'd be even sadder. She said I should help you." Rosa knelt down beside her niece. "Layla, what lady? There wasn't anyone else here?" "She was standing right next to his car," Layla said matter-of-factly. "She had grey hair like my abuela, but softer, and she was wearing a yellow dress with little flowers on it." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Margaret's favorite dress, the one she'd been wearing the day she'd had her stroke, was yellow with tiny white daisies. She'd bought it for their planned trip to see the cherry blossoms in Washington, D.C., a trip they'd never taken. "Did she tell you her name?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Layla shook her head. "She just said to tell you that you need to take better care of yourself, and that she's not going anywhere, even if it looks like she is." The parking lot was filling with people now. Hospital staff, construction workers, curious onlookers drawn by the crash. Someone was directing traffic away from the wreckage, and Thomas could hear sirens approaching, but all of it seemed to be happening at a great distance. His entire focus had narrowed to this child who had somehow saved his life and was now delivering a message that could only have come from his wife. "Mr. Mitchell." Rosa was looking at him with concern. "Are you all right? You look pale." Thomas reached out and gently touched Layla's cheek. She didn't flinch away, just looked at him with that same serious expression. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded as if this was exactly the response she'd been expecting. "You're welcome. The lady said you're a very good man, and good men deserve to be safe." A security guard approached them, clipboard in hand. "Sir, was that your vehicle?" Thomas looked at the twisted remains of his sedan. "Yes. We're going to need you to fill out some paperwork. Insurance, that sort of thing. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Thomas glanced at Rosa, then down at Layla. How could he possibly explain that a 6-year-old girl had warned him away from his car because a woman in a yellow dress, a woman who had been in a coma for 3 months, had told her to? "I heard a strange noise from the crane," he said finally. "Thought it might be prudent to move away from the car. It wasn't exactly a lie." He had heard something, even if it was after Layla's warning. The security guard made notes on his clipboard while Thomas provided his information. Rosa stood nearby with Layla, occasionally glancing at Thomas with an expression he couldn't quite read. Curiosity perhaps mixed with something that might have been concern. When the paperwork was finished and the security guard had moved on to interview other witnesses, Rosa approached Thomas again. "Mr. Mitchell, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When Layla described that woman, the one in the yellow dress, you looked like you'd seen a ghost." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the crane operators who had arrived to assess the damage. In the distance, a tow truck was being positioned to clear away the wreckage. "My wife loves yellow," he said finally. "It's her favorite color." Rosa studied his face. "Your wife who's in extended care?" "Margaret. She's been in a coma for 3 months now. Massive stroke." The words still felt like swallowing glass. "Before it happened, she bought this dress for a trip we were planning to take, yellow with little white flowers. She was wearing it the day—" He stopped, unable to finish. Rosa's expression softened with understanding. "Oh my God! And Layla described exactly what Margaret was wearing that day, yes." They stood in silence for a moment, watching Layla wander a few steps away to examine a piece of twisted metal that had broken off from the crane arm. Even in the aftermath of the accident, she seemed calmer than she had when she'd first run screaming from the hospital. "This is going to sound crazy," Rosa said quietly, "but Layla has been acting strange ever since her grandmother died 6 months ago. She talks about seeing people that aren't there, hearing voices. Her parents are worried sick about her." "What do the doctors say?" "That it's probably grief. That children sometimes create imaginary friends to help cope with loss. They've been talking about therapy, medication." Rosa shook her head. "But what just happened? She saved your life, Mr. Mitchell. How do you explain that with grief counseling?" Thomas didn't have an answer. In his 4 decades of nursing, he'd seen things that couldn't be easily explained. Patients who recovered when they should have died. Families who seemed to know the exact moment their loved ones passed away, even when they were miles from the hospital. He'd always chalked it up to coincidence, to the mysterious ways that stress and hope could play tricks on the mind. But this felt different. This felt real in a way that made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. "Would you mind if I visited your wife sometime?" Rosa asked. "I mean, if that's not too personal, it's just, I think maybe Layla isn't the only one who needs someone to talk to." Thomas looked at her with surprise. In the 3 months since Margaret's stroke, very few people had offered companionship without expecting something in return. Most of their old friends had gradually stopped calling, unsure of what to say or how to help. Margaret's sister visited occasionally, but those encounters were usually filled with discussions about difficult decisions Thomas wasn't ready to make. "I'd like that," he said. Margaret is very good with children. She taught elementary school for 30 years before she retired. If she could wake up and meet Layla, I think she'd be delighted. Layla had wandered back to them, her attention caught by something only she could see. She was looking toward the hospital entrance with the same focused intensity she'd shown when warning Thomas about the crane. "She's here again," Layla said, softly. "Who's here?" Rosa asked. "The lady in the yellow dress. She says thank you for listening to me." Layla looked up at Thomas. "She wants to know if you'll come see her tomorrow. She says she has more things to tell you, but it's hard for her to talk when she's sleeping." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "More things to tell me?" "About taking care of yourself, and about the other people who need help." Layla tilted, her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "She says there are lots of sad people in the hospital, and maybe you and I can help them together." Rosa took her niece's hand. "Layla, we should probably get back to Aunt Carmen. She'll be wondering where we went." "Can we come back tomorrow?" Layla asked, looking directly at Thomas. "I promised the lady I'd help you visit her." Thomas found himself nodding before he'd consciously made the decision. "If it's all right with your family, I'd be very grateful for the company." As they walked back toward the hospital entrance, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 months, a sense of anticipation about tomorrow. For the first time since Margaret's stroke, he was curious about what the next day might bring, rather than simply dreading another cycle of hope and disappointment. Behind them, the work crews continued clearing the wreckage of the crane accident. But Thomas wasn't thinking about twisted metal and shattered glass anymore. He was thinking about a 6-year-old girl who talked to spirits, and a woman in a yellow dress who apparently had more to say to him than goodbye. Thomas spent that night staring at the ceiling of his empty bedroom, Margaret's pillow still holding, the faint impression of her head, despite 3 months of absence. Every rational part of his mind insisted that what had happened in the parking lot was nothing more than coincidence, a lucky guess by an imaginative child who had happened to notice something about the crane that adults had missed. But rational explanations didn't account for the yellow dress with white flowers. He arrived at the hospital earlier than usual the next morning, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cafeteria and a small bag of cookies he'd picked up from the gift shop. If Rosa and Layla were going to visit Margaret, he wanted to make them feel welcome. Margaret had always been the hostess in their marriage, the one who remembered to offer refreshments and ask about people's families. Thomas was learning slowly to fill those spaces she'd left behind. Margaret's room was on the 3rd floor of the extended care unit, a place designed to feel more like a bedroom than a medical facility. Thomas had insisted on paying the extra cost for a private room with a window, and he'd brought some of Margaret's favorite things from home: photographs, her favorite quilt, a small radio that played classical music during the day. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said softly, settling into the chair beside her bed. Margaret lay still as always, her breathing steady but shallow, her face peaceful in a way that could be mistaken for sleep, if not for the feeding tube and monitors. "I brought you visitors today, a little girl who says she's talked to you." He reached for Margaret's hand, noting as he always did how cool her skin felt, how her wedding ring had left a pale indentation on her finger. Thomas had moved the ring to his keychain after the swelling made it too tight, but he found himself missing the familiar weight of it on her hand. "I know how that sounds," he continued, stroking her palm gently. 6 months ago, I would have called it nonsense. But she knew about your dress, Margaret. She described you perfectly. down to the way you wear your hair. Margaret's hair had grown longer during her coma, and Thomas had learned to brush it the way she'd taught him years ago when she'd broken her wrist and needed help getting ready for work. The nurses offered to cut it shorter for easier care, but Thomas couldn't bear the thought of changing anything about her appearance. "She saved my life yesterday," he whispered. "If that was you, if you're somehow still able to—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. In 3 months, he'd never allowed himself to hope for anything more than the doctor's cautious optimism. Hope was too dangerous. It made the daily disappointments unbearable. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Rosa peered in, with Layla beside her holding what appeared to be a drawing. "I hope we're not too early," Rosa said. "Layla insisted we come first thing this morning." "Not at all. Please, come in." Thomas stood, gesturing to the small seating area he'd arranged near the window. "I brought coffee, if you drink it, and cookies for Layla." "Thank you, that's very kind." Rosa accepted the coffee gratefully, but her attention was focused on Layla, who had walked straight to Margaret's bedside and was staring at the unconscious woman with the same intense concentration she'd shown the night before. "Is she the lady from your dreams?" Rosa asked gently. Layla nodded slowly. "She looks different when she's sleeping, but it's her. She has the same kind eyes." The child reached into her small purse and pulled out a string of rosary beads, worn, smooth with age. "My abuela gave me these before she died. She said they would help me talk to people who are hard to hear." Thomas recognized the beads immediately. They were similar to the ones Margaret kept on her nightstand at home, a gift from her own grandmother decades ago. Margaret wasn't particularly religious, but she'd always found comfort in the familiar rhythm of the prayers, the smooth texture of the beads between her fingers. "Your grandmother had special gifts too?" Thomas asked, settling back into his chair. "Mommy says she always knew things before they happened. When people were going to die, when babies were going to be born, when someone was in trouble." Layla held the rosary carefully, as if it were made of something more precious than wood and metal. "After she died, I started hearing voices. That's when my parents got scared." Rosa sipped her coffee and watched her niece with worried eyes. "The other children at school think she's strange now. She knows things about their families, their pets. Last week she told her teacher that the hamster in their classroom was going to have babies, even though everyone thought it was male." "And was she right?" 7 babies, born 3 days later." Rosa shook her head. "The teacher called my sister, wanting to know how Layla could have known. What was she supposed to say?" Layla had moved closer to Margaret's bed and was holding the rosary out toward the sleeping woman. "She wants me to put these in her hand," she said matter-of-factly. Thomas hesitated. The medical staff had been very specific about not placing objects in Margaret's hands that she couldn't grip properly. There was always a risk of injury if her muscles contracted unexpectedly. But something about Layla's certainty made him reconsider. "Just for a few minutes," he said, helping the child place the rosary gently in Margaret's palm. What happened next would stay with Thomas for the rest of his life. Margaret's fingers, which hadn't moved purposefully in 3 months, slowly curled around the beads. It was subtle, barely noticeable unless you were watching closely, but unmistakable. Her thumb brushed across the smooth surface of one bead, then another, in the familiar pattern of the Hail Mary prayer. "Did you see that?" Rosa whispered, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. Thomas leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Margaret, sweetheart, can you hear me?" Margaret's fingers continued their slow movement across the beads. Her breathing seemed deeper, more purposeful, and there was the faintest suggestion of movement behind her closed eyelids. "She's not waking up," Layla said calmly, as if she were commenting on the weather. "But she's trying to show you that she can hear everything you say to her. She says you read to her every night, and she loves the sound of your voice." Thomas felt tears burning his eyes. He did read to Margaret, passages from books they'd enjoyed together, articles from the newspaper, letters from friends. The nurses had encouraged it, saying that coma patients often retained some level of awareness, but Thomas had never had any sign that Margaret was actually listening. "What else does she say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Layla tilted her head, as if listening to a conversation only she could hear. "She's worried about you. She says you're not eating enough, and you're not sleeping in your bed anymore." Rosa looked at Thomas with surprise, but he was too focused on Layla to explain. The child was right. He'd been sleeping in his recliner, downstairs, unable to face the empty expanse of their king-sized bed. "She says the house is too quiet without music," Layla continued. "She wants you to play the piano again. The one in your living room with the pictures on top." Thomas's breath caught. Margaret had always loved to listen to him play, especially in the evenings after dinner. He'd been a decent pianist in his youth, good enough to play for their churches. Small choir, and Margaret would often sit nearby with her knitting or a book, humming along to familiar melodies. He hadn't touched the piano since her stroke. The house was indeed too quiet, but music would have made the silence afterward even more unbearable. "There's more," Layla said, her expression growing more serious. "She says there are other people in this hospital who need help, families who are scared and don't know what to do. She thinks maybe you and I could help them, like we're helping each other." Thomas looked at Rosa, who was staring at her niece with a mixture of wonder and concern. "Layla, honey, what kind of help?" "Some people need to know it's okay to let go," Layla said simply, "and some people need to know it's okay to keep hoping. She says you're very good at knowing which is which because you've helped so many families before." It was true. In his 43 years of nursing, Thomas had guided countless families through the most difficult decisions of their lives. He'd learned to read the subtle signs, when a patient was fighting to stay, when they were ready to leave, when the family needed permission to make peace with either choice. It was a skill he'd developed through experience and instinct, though he'd never thought of it as a gift. "She wants me to bring you to meet some of them," Layla said, "starting today." Thomas felt a flutter of something that might have been purpose, stirring in his chest. For 3 months his world had narrowed to this room, these daily visits, this endless waiting. The idea of helping other families navigate their own crises felt both terrifying and compelling. "Which families?" he asked. Layla looked around the room as if seeing people who weren't there. "There's a man whose son was in a car accident. He's been angry at everyone, and it's making his son scared to get better. And there's a woman whose mother is dying, but she won't come visit because she thinks her mother doesn't recognize her anymore." Thomas knew both cases without needing names. ICU gossip traveled quickly through the hospital's informal networks, and he'd heard the staff discussing the hostile father in room 302 and the elderly woman in 318 whose daughter hadn't visited in weeks. "How do you know about these people?" Rosa asked, her voice carefully controlled. "The lady in yellow tells me," Layla said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "She says there are lots of spirits in hospitals because this is where people come when they're deciding whether to stay or go. Most of them want to help their families understand, but they can't make themselves heard." Thomas looked down at Margaret, whose fingers were still moving slowly across the rosary beads. "And you can hear them?" "Not all of them. Just the ones who really need help." Layla reached over and gently adjusted Margaret's blanket. "Your wife has a very strong voice, even when she's sleeping. That's how she was able to warn me about the crane." The room fell silent, except for the quiet hum of Margaret's monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital hallway. Thomas found himself at a crossroads he'd never imagined, between the rational world he'd inhabited for nearly 7 decades and something far more mysterious and profound. "If we do this," he said finally, "if we try to help these families, what exactly would we be doing?" Layla smiled for the first time since he'd met her, and the expression transformed her serious little face into something bright and hopeful. "We'd be like translators," she said, "helping people understand each other when they can't find the right words." The first family they approached was the hardest. Thomas had known David Chen by reputation long before the accident that put his 17-year-old son in the ICU. David was a successful contractor who'd built half the commercial developments in their small city, a man known for his precision, his demanding standards, and his explosive temper when things didn't go according to plan. Now his son Michael lay unconscious in room 302, the victim of a late-night collision with a drunk driver, and David's famous control was fracturing in ways that made the entire staff uncomfortable. He screams at the nurses, Rosa had confided to Thomas over lunch in the cafeteria. Yesterday, he accused Dr. Martinez of incompetence because Michael's blood pressure dropped during a routine procedure. The day before that, he demanded a different respiratory therapist because he didn't like the way she adjusted the ventilator settings. Thomas had observed David from a distance, a man in his 50s pacing the corridors like a caged animal. His expensive suits wrinkled from sleeping in waiting room chairs, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and something that looked like barely contained rage. "The staff is starting to avoid the room," Rosa continued, "which means Michael isn't getting the attention he needs because nobody wants to deal with his father." Layla had been listening to their conversation with the same focused attention she brought to everything. "The boy is scared," she said suddenly. Thomas and Rosa looked at her with surprise. They'd been discussing David's behavior, not Michael's condition. "Scared of what, honey?" Rosa asked. "Scared that his daddy is so angry at everyone that he'll forget to love him." Layla was holding Margaret's recipe book, which Thomas had brought from home that morning. The worn notebook contained 40 years of Margaret's handwritten recipes, from the simple meals they'd shared as newlyweds to the elaborate holiday spreads she'd perfected over decades of hosting family gatherings. "The boy's spirit is trying to wake up, but he hears all the yelling and thinks maybe it's better to stay asleep." Thomas felt a chill of recognition. He'd seen this pattern before. Patients whose recovery seemed stalled not by medical factors, but by the emotional climate around their bedside. Family stress could be as toxic as any infection, and David Chen's fury was poisoning the atmosphere in room 302. "What does he need?" Thomas asked. Layla closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening to a conversation only she could hear. "He needs his daddy to remember who they were before the accident. He needs to hear stories about good times, not angry words about doctors." That afternoon, Thomas found David Chen in the hospital chapel, not praying, but sitting in the back pew with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. The contrast between this broken man and the furious presence he'd been displaying in his son's room was jarring. "Mr. Chen?" Thomas approached carefully, the way he'd learned to approach grieving families over 4 decades of practice. "I'm Thomas Mitchell. I'm a retired nurse here at the hospital." David looked up, his eyes immediately wary. "If you're here to tell me I need to control my temper, save your breath. I've heard it from everyone else. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about Michael." Thomas settled into the pew beside him, noting how David's hands were trembling slightly. "I understand he's a good kid. The best." David's voice cracked. "Honor roll varsity baseball. Never gave us a moment of trouble. He was supposed to start college in the fall, had a scholarship to state for engineering." The words poured out as if they'd been dammed up too long. "He was coming home from his girlfriend's house when it happened. If I hadn't been such a hard-ass about his curfew, if I'd let him stay over like he wanted." "This isn't your fault," Thomas said quietly. "Isn't it?" David turned to face him, and Thomas saw the guilt that had been driving the anger. "I made him come home because I was worried about what the neighbors would think. My son is lying in that bed because I cared more about appearances than his safety. Thomas had heard variations of this story countless times, the terrible arithmetic of guilt that families performed when tragedy struck, the way they assigned blame to themselves for events beyond their control. Mr. Chen, in 30 years of working with families in crisis, I've learned that guilt is just grief wearing a disguise. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The doctors say he might not wake up, that even if he does, there could be permanent brain damage. His voice dropped to a whisper. I don't know how to live with that possibility. You live with it by being his father, not his judge and jury. Thomas chose his words carefully. The staff tells me you've been very demanding about Michael's care. Damn right I have. If I don't advocate for him, who will? There's a difference between advocating and terrorizing. Right now, the people caring for your son are walking on eggshells around you. That's not helping Michael. It's making everyone so nervous they're not doing their best work. David was quiet for a long moment, staring at the simple cross mounted on the chapel's front wall. I don't know how to be anything other than angry right now. If I'm not angry, I'm scared, and I can't function when I'm scared. Thomas understood. He'd seen this defense mechanism before, the way some people used rage as armor against vulnerability. What if I told you that Michael might be aware of your presence, that he might be able to hear the emotional climate in his room, even if he can't respond? The doctors say there's no way to know. The doctors know about brain function and medical indicators, but I'm talking about something else. Thomas pulled out his phone and showed David a photo of Layla. This little girl has been helping families communicate with patients who can't speak for themselves. I know how that sounds, but yesterday she helped me understand that my wife, who's been in a coma for 3 months, has been aware of everything I've been saying to her. David stared at the photo. You're talking about psychics? Fortune tellers? I'm talking about a 6-year-old girl who saved my life by warning me about an accident before it happened, and who seems to have a gift for hearing what patients need their families to know. Thomas met David's skeptical gaze steadily. What if she could help you understand what Michael needs from you right now? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the hospital beyond the chapel doors. Finally, David spoke. What would I have to do? Just listen, and be prepared to hear things that might be hard to accept. Thomas stood up. Michael's been unconscious for 2 weeks. In that time, you've been his fierce protector, his advocate, his champion. But maybe what he needs now is just his father, the man who taught him to throw a curveball and helped him with algebra homework and worried about him coming home safely at night. David nodded slowly. When can we meet this girl? This evening, if you're willing, but Mr. Chen... Thomas paused at the chapel door. Whatever she tells you about Michael, it's going to require you to be vulnerable in front of strangers. Are you prepared for that? David looked back at the cross, then at the photo of Layla on Thomas's phone. If there's even a chance it could help my son, I'll do whatever it takes. As Thomas walked back toward the elevator, he felt the familiar mixture of hope and terror that came with taking on a new challenge. In his nursing career, he'd guided families through countless crises, but he'd always had medical protocols and institutional support to fall back on. This was different, more personal, more uncertain, and potentially more meaningful than anything he'd done before. Margaret's recipe book was still tucked under his arm, its worn pages filled with evidence of a life lived in service to others. Margaret had always believed that the most important healing happened not through medicine, but through connection. The simple act of one person caring enough to truly listen to another. Perhaps it was time for Thomas to learn a new kind of healing. That evening, Thomas met Rosa and Layla outside Michael Chen's room, carrying his old nursing school stethoscope, a battered instrument he'd kept long after upgrading to newer equipment, more for sentimental value than practical use. The stethoscope had been with him through 4 decades of listening to hearts, learning to distinguish between the rhythms of health and illness, hope and despair. David Chen stood outside his son's room, visibly struggling with nervousness. He'd changed from his wrinkled business suit into jeans and a baseball jersey, Michael's number from his high school team. "I feel ridiculous," David admitted as Thomas approached. "I'm about to ask a 6-year-old to tell me what my unconscious son is thinking." "You're about to listen with an open heart," Thomas corrected gently. "That's never ridiculous." Rosa knelt, down beside Layla, who was clutching her grandmother's rosary and looking unusually solemn. "Are you sure you want to do this, Mija? You don't have to if it feels scary." Layla looked through the doorway at Michael, a teenager surrounded by machines, his face peaceful but unnaturally still. "He's not scary," she said. "He's just sad and confused, like when I got lost in the mall and couldn't find you." They entered the room quietly. Michael Chen was 17, tall for his age, even lying down, with the lean build of an athlete. The ventilator breathed for him in steady rhythms, and monitors tracked his vital signs with electronic precision. But it was the baseball photos, taped to the wall, that caught Thomas's attention. Images of Michael at different ages, always with David beside him, both of them grinning with shared pride. "He looks like you," Layla observed, studying David's face. "Everyone says that." David moved to his son's bedside, his hand hovering over Michael's arm, as if afraid to make contact. "He got his mother's brains, thank God, but yeah, he looks like me." Layla approached the bed slowly, the way children do when they're trying not to wake someone. "Can I hold his hand?" David nodded, and Layla carefully slipped her small fingers around Michael's much larger ones. Almost immediately, her expression changed, becoming more focused, as if she were listening to something very important. "He says the beeping is too loud," she said after a moment. "It makes him think something's wrong, but nobody will tell him." "What?" Thomas glanced at the monitors. The sounds were normal, reassuring to medical staff who understood their meaning, but potentially alarming to someone who didn't know they indicated stable function rather than crisis. "What else?" David asked, his voice tight with emotion. "He's worried about baseball season. His team made it to regionals, and he thinks they can't win without him." Layla's head tilted as if she were having a conversation. "He wants to know if Coach Morrison found someone else to play shortstop." David's face crumpled. "The season ended 2 weeks ago. They won regionals, made it all the way to state finals." He leaned closer to his son. "Michael, if you can hear me, the team won. Jake Patterson played your position, and he did great. But everyone said they were playing for you." Layla nodded approvingly. "That makes him happy, but he's still confused about why everyone sounds so worried when they talk to him." She looked at David with those serious dark eyes. "He says you sound angry all the time, and it makes him think he did something wrong." The words hit David like a physical blow. He sank into the chair beside the bed, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Oh God, Michael, you didn't do anything wrong. I'm angry at the world, at the drunk who hit you, at myself for not protecting you better, but never at you." "Tell him about the good things," Layla said softly. "He wants to remember the good things." For the next hour, David talked to his unconscious son in a way he hadn't since the accident. He told stories about Michael's childhood, about fishing trips and little league games, and the time Michael had tried to fix the family car with a toy wrench at age 4. He talked about his pride in Michael's academic achievements, his excitement about college, his hopes for the future they'd planned together. Thomas watched the monitors during David's stories and noticed something remarkable. Michael's heart rate became more stable, his breathing patterns more regular. The medical equipment showed what Layla seemed to sense instinctively, that healing happened as much through emotional connection as through physical intervention. "There's something else," Layla said as David's stories wound down. He wants you to know that he's not ready to go anywhere yet. He's still fighting to come back, but it's hard work and it might take a long time. David reached for his son's hand, no longer afraid to touch him. Take all the time you need, buddy. I'm not going anywhere. And he says... Layla paused, her expression growing more serious. He says you need to be nicer to the people who are helping him. They're doing their best, and when you yell at them, it makes them nervous, and nervous people make mistakes. Rosa suppressed a smile at the child's blunt delivery, but Thomas could see that the message had found its mark. David looked genuinely chastened. I'll do better, David promised his son. I'll apologize to the nurses and doctors tomorrow. I've been scared out of my mind, but that's no excuse for treating people badly. As they prepared to leave, Layla lingered beside Michael's bed. He wants me to tell you one more thing, she said to David. He says he loves you too, and he's proud to be your son, even when you're being a grumpy old bear. David laughed through his tears, the first genuine laughter Thomas had heard from him. He's been calling me that since he was 10 years old. Outside, Michael's room, David turned to Thomas with an expression of wonder and gratitude. I don't understand how she does it, but she's given me my son back. Not physically, not yet, but in every way that matters. Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what David meant. Sometimes the most important healing happens in the spaces between heartbeats, in the words we speak to people who might be listening even when they can't respond. What can I do to repay you? Be the father Michael needs, Thomas said simply. And maybe when he wakes up, not if, when, remember that miracles sometimes come in small packages. As they walked toward the elevator, Rosa fell into step beside Thomas. How did you know it would work? Thomas considered the question, fingering his old stethoscope. I didn't. But 43 years of nursing taught me that listening is often more powerful than any medication we can prescribe. Layla just has a gift for hearing what the rest of us miss. And you? What's your gift? Thomas thought about Margaret lying in her hospital bed, about the families he'd guided through impossible decisions, about the way healing happened through connection rather than just medical intervention. I think maybe I'm learning that my gift is helping people find each other, he said, even when they're lost in places that seem impossible to navigate. The elevator doors closed, carrying them down from Michael Chen's room, but Thomas could feel something new beginning, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with medical protocols and everything to do with the mysterious ways that love persists even in the darkest places. 3 days later, Thomas found himself standing in Margaret's garden at dawn, holding a pressed flower between his fingers, a white daisy she'd carefully preserved in one of her books the previous spring. The flower was from the same variety that decorated her yellow dress, the one Layla had described with impossible accuracy. The garden had been Margaret's pride for nearly 2 decades, a carefully tended sanctuary behind their modest ranch house, where she'd grown everything from prize-winning roses to the herbs she used in her cooking. Thomas had helped with the heavy work, turning soil, building raised beds, installing the irrigation system, but the garden's soul belonged to Margaret. Now, after 3 months of neglect, it was a tangle of weeds and overgrown plants, beautiful in its wildness, but clearly abandoned. Thomas had avoided coming here since Margaret's stroke, unable to face the physical reminder of all the routines they'd shared, all the plans they'd made for retirement years that might never come. But Layla had been insistent the day before, relaying another message from the woman in the yellow dress. She says you need to go to the place where you planted hope together. She has something important to show you. Thomas knelt beside what had once been Margaret's herb garden, now a chaos of mint and oregano, growing far beyond their intended boundaries. Hidden beneath the overgrowth, he'd found something that made his breath catch, a small notebook wrapped in plastic, containing Margaret's handwriting. The journal was something he'd never seen before, filled with entries dating back to the weeks before her stroke. As he read her words in the morning light, he began to understand that Margaret had been experiencing symptoms, headaches, moments of confusion, a strange sense of impending change that she'd kept hidden from him. March 15th. Another headache. Today, worse than usual. I didn't tell Thomas because he worries so much about everything lately, but I'm starting to think something is wrong. I've been having the strangest dreams, visions of a little girl with serious eyes who needs help finding her way. In the dreams, Thomas is with her, and they're helping people who are lost between staying and leaving. It doesn't make sense, but the dreams feel more real than waking sometimes. Thomas's hands trembled as he turned the page. March 22nd. The headaches are getting worse, but I've been hiding them. I know I should see a doctor, but I'm terrified of what they might find. Thomas has given so much of his life to caring for other people's medical crises. I can't bear the thought of making him face one in his own home. Maybe if I just rest more, eat better, take those vitamins he's always pushing on me. The entries continued, revealing a woman who had sensed her own mortality approaching but had tried to protect her husband from the knowledge. More disturbing were the repeated references to dreams about Thomas and a child working together to help families in crisis. Dreams that had apparently begun weeks before Margaret's stroke, months before Thomas had ever met Layla. March 30th. I found myself in the garden this morning with no memory of how I got there. I was holding a daisy and crying, though I couldn't remember why. The strangest thing, I felt compelled to press the flower in my cookbook as if it were important to preserve it for someone else to find. The dreams about Thomas and the little girl are getting more vivid. Last night I dreamed I was wearing my yellow dress, standing in a hospital parking lot, watching them help a man whose son couldn't wake up. I woke up certain it was real, even though that makes no sense. Thomas set the journal aside and looked at the pressed daisy in his palm. Margaret had preserved this flower on the very day she'd described her dream about the hospital parking lot, a dream that had apparently come true with startling accuracy 3 months later. April 2nd. I need to write this down in case something happens to me, and Thomas needs to understand later. The dreams aren't just dreams, they're visions of something that's going to happen after I'm gone, or mostly gone. I see myself trying to help him find a new purpose, a new way to use his gift for healing. The little girl is key to everything. She can hear things others can't, and Thomas can help her translate what she hears into something that helps families heal. The final entry was dated April 5th, 3 days before Margaret's stroke. I'm scared, but I'm also strangely peaceful. Whatever is coming, I think it's part of something larger than just my illness. Thomas is going to need help navigating grief, and somehow this child is going to be the bridge that helps him find his way back to purpose. I pray that when the time comes, he'll be brave enough to listen to what seems impossible and trust what feels true. Thomas closed the journal and sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the implications of what he'd read. Margaret had somehow foreseen not just her own medical crisis, but the specific way her illness would lead to his meeting Layla and their work together, helping other families. The rational part of his mind insisted this was nothing more than coincidence. A woman's anxiety about her health manifesting in dreams that seemed prophetic only in retrospect. But the details were too specific, too accurate, too precisely aligned with events that had unfolded exactly as Margaret had described them. His phone buzzed with a text from Rosa. "Emergency at hospital. Can you meet us in room 318, Layla says. The lady in yellow is very urgent about something. Thomas pocketed Margaret's journal and the pressed daisy. his heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Room 318 was where Elena Martinez had been dying slowly for the past month, while her daughter Carmen, Rosa's sister, avoided visiting because she couldn't bear to watch her mother's decline. As he drove to the hospital, Thomas found himself thinking about the strange mathematics of loss and healing. Margaret had sacrificed her final weeks of health to hide her symptoms from him, trying to protect him from pain. Carmen was sacrificing her final chance to reconcile with her mother, trying to protect herself from the same kind of pain. But Layla had shown them that protection and isolation weren't the same thing, that sometimes the bravest act was allowing yourself to be vulnerable in the presence of love, even when that love came with the certainty of loss. The hospital parking lot looked different now, marked by the space where his car had been crushed by the falling crane. The construction crews had finished repairs and moved on, but Thomas would never be able to walk through that area without remembering the moment when a 6-year-old girl had saved his life by trusting a message from a woman in a yellow dress. As he headed toward the elevator, Margaret's journal heavy in his pocket, Thomas wondered if he was ready for whatever revelation was waiting in room 318. The past few days had already challenged everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between life and death, between the possible and the impossible. But Margaret's final entry had been clear about one thing: whatever was coming next would require him to be brave enough to listen to what seemed impossible and trust what felt true. Thomas pressed the elevator, a button for the 3rd floor, and prepared to take another leap of faith. Thomas found Rosa and Layla outside room 318, both looking unusually grave. Rosa was holding a hospital bracelet. Not the standard patient identification band, but an older one, yellowed with age and bearing Thomas's name from a brief hospitalization 2 years earlier. "Where did you find that?" Thomas asked, recognizing the bracelet immediately. He'd been admitted for chest pains that had turned out to be nothing more serious than stress and exhaustion. But the experience had terrified Margaret. She'd kept the bracelet afterward, claiming she wanted to remind him to take better care of himself. "It was in Layla's pocket when we got here," Rosa said, her expression troubled. "She says the lady in yellow gave it to her, along with some very specific instructions." Layla looked up at Thomas with those serious, dark eyes. "She's worried about your heart. She says you've been having pains again, but you're not telling anyone because you're scared of leaving her alone." Thomas felt heat rise in his face. The child was right. He had been experiencing chest discomfort for the past week, the same tight, squeezing sensation that had sent him to the emergency room 2 years ago. But the timing was impossible. Margaret needed him now more than ever, and he couldn't bear the thought of being hospitalized while she lay unconscious and vulnerable. "Thomas," Rosa said gently, her nurse's training evident in her voice, "chest pain isn't something you ignore, especially at your age, especially with your stress levels." "I'm fine," Thomas said automatically, the same words he'd been telling himself for days. "It's just anxiety. It's been a difficult time." Layla shook her head firmly. "The lady says that's what you said last time, and you weren't fine then either. She says if something happens to you, she'll be all alone, and that scares her more than staying asleep." The words hit Thomas harder than any medical warning could have. In his determination to be strong for Margaret, he'd been risking the very thing she needed most, his continued presence in her life. "We need to get you checked out," Rosa said. "But first, there's something urgent happening with Mrs. Martinez. Layla says her daughter needs to get here immediately." Through the doorway, Thomas could see Elena Martinez, a woman in her 70s, who'd been battling cancer for the better part of a year. She'd been in hospice care for the past month, her conditions stable but deteriorating slowly. Her daughter Carmen, Rosa's sister, had been avoiding visits, claiming she couldn't handle watching her mother waste away. "What's changed?" Thomas asked. Layla walked into the room and approached Eleanor's bedside with the same careful attention. She'd shown with Michael Chen. "She's getting ready to leave," Layla said simply, "but she can't go until her daughter forgives her." Forgives her for what? For not being a perfect mother, for working too much when Carmen was little, for not knowing how to show love the way Carmen needed to receive it. Layla placed her small hand on Eleanor's arm. "She says Carmen thinks her mother never really loved her, but that's not true. She just loved her in the only way she knew how." Thomas understood the dynamics immediately. He'd seen this pattern countless times. Adult children who stayed away from dying parents because unresolved conflicts made grief too complicated to navigate. The fear that reconciliation was impossible often prevented families from attempting it, even when time was running out. "Has anyone called Carmen?" Thomas asked. "She won't answer our calls," Rosa admitted. "She says she doesn't want to watch her mother die, that it's too hard. But I think she's really afraid that her mother will die without ever understanding." "How much she hurt Carmen growing up," Layla nodded gravely. "The mother knows she made mistakes. She wants to tell Carmen she's sorry, but Carmen won't come to hear it." Thomas felt the familiar weight of a family in crisis, the delicate balance between respecting people's choices and helping them overcome the fears that prevented healing. In his nursing career, he'd learned that some of the most important medical interventions had nothing to do with medications or procedures. They involved creating space for conversations that seemed impossible, but were essential for peace. "What if we went to Carmen instead of asking her to come here?" Thomas suggested. Rosa looked surprised. "You mean like a house call?" "I mean like people who care about both of them, trying to bridge a gap that feels too wide to cross alone." Thomas looked at Layla, who was still focused on Eleanor with that intense concentration. "What do you think? Would that work?" Layla tilted her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "The mother says yes, but we have to hurry. She's been holding on for weeks waiting for Carmen to come, and she's very tired now." Rosa pulled out her phone. "Carmen lives about 20 minutes away. I can drive us there, but Thomas, promise me we'll go straight to the emergency room after this. Your health can't wait." Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure how he'd find time for his own medical concerns, with Eleanor Martinez dying and Margaret still in her coma and families throughout the hospital needing the kind of help he was only beginning to understand how to provide. As they left the hospital, Thomas caught sight of his reflection in the lobby's glass doors. He looked older than his 67 years, worn down by months of stress and sleepless nights. The hospital bracelet in Rosa's hand was a tangible reminder that his body was sending warnings he'd been trying to ignore. Margaret's journal, still in his pocket, seemed to grow heavier as they walked to Rosa's car. Her final entries had predicted this moment with eerie accuracy. His health crisis, the families he'd help, even the specific ways Layla's gift would manifest. If Margaret had foreseen all of this, what else had she known about what was coming? The drive to Carmen's house took them through the older part of town, past the elementary school where Margaret had taught for 30 years. Thomas found himself looking at the playground where Margaret had supervised countless recesses, the windows of the classroom where she'd guided thousands of children through their first encounters with literature and mathematics, and the broader world beyond there. "Families, did you always want to be a nurse?" Rosa asked as they stopped at a red light. "Actually, I wanted to be a teacher like Margaret, but my family needed the steadier income that nursing provided, so I made the practical choice." Thomas smiled at the memory. "Margaret used to say that I ended up teaching anyway, just teaching families how to navigate the hardest lessons of their lives." And now, Thomas considered the question as they turned onto Carmen Street. "Now I think maybe Margaret saw something I couldn't see about how all these pieces fit together. My experience with families in crisis, Layla's gift for hearing what others can't, your skills as a nurse and your connection to families who need help. Maybe this isn't a coincidence. Maybe it's what people call a calling." Rosa said softly. As they parked in front of Carmen's small house, Thomas felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that came with approaching a family in crisis. But this time, there was something else, a sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, even if the path forward remained uncertain. Layla climbed out of the back seat, still clutching her grandmother's rosary, and looked up at the house with determination. "The mother says Carmen is crying," Layla announced. "She's been crying for weeks, but she thinks her tears don't matter because her mother is dying anyway." Thomas took a deep breath, feeling Margaret's journal against his chest and the weight of promise it contained. Whatever happened next, he was committed to helping this family find their way back to each other, even if it meant putting his own needs aside a little longer. The hardest healings he was learning often required the healer to be vulnerable. 2. Carmen Herrera answered her door with red-rimmed eyes and a defensive posture that immediately reminded Thomas of David Chen's initial hostility. But where David's grief had manifested as anger, Carmen's showed itself as exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been fighting her own emotions for too long. "Rosa, I told you I can't—" Carmen stopped when she saw Thomas and Layla. "Who are these people?" "Carmen, this is Thomas Mitchell, the nurse I told you about, and this is Layla." Rosa's voice was gentle but firm. "They're here because your mother needs to see you. My mother is dying, and there's nothing left to say between us." Carmen started to close the door, but Layla stepped forward. "Your mama wants you to know she's sorry," Layla said with the directness that had become familiar to Thomas. "She says she knows she worked too much when you were little, and she knows you felt like the house was more important to her than you were." Carmen froze, her hand still on the doorframe. "What did you say?" Layla held up a child's drawing she'd pulled from her small purse, a crayon picture of 3 figures holding hands, drawn in the unmistakable style of elementary school art. "She wants me to show you this." Thomas recognized the drawing immediately. It was the kind of family portrait children created in school, with stick figures representing mother, father, and child. But this drawing was old, the paper yellowed and worn, as if it had been handled many times over the years. "Where did you get that?" Carmen's voice was barely a whisper. "From the box under your mama's bed, the one with all your school pictures, and report cards and the letters you wrote her when you went to college." Layla's expression was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing something as ordinary as the weather. "She kept everything you ever made for her. She looks at them when she's sad." Carmen sank against the doorframe, her composure finally cracking. "That's impossible. I drew that when I was 7 years old. I threw it away because she barely looked at it when I brought it home from school. She kept it for 40 years, Layla said simply, "along with all the other pictures and the Mother's Day cards and the poem you wrote about her being the most beautiful mama in the world." Thomas watched Carmen's face transform as the child's words sank in. He'd seen this moment before, the instant when someone's entire understanding of their relationship with another person shifted, when years of assumed indifference were revealed to be something else entirely. "How could you possibly know about that box?" Carmen asked, her voice shaking. Layla tilted her head with that familiar listening expression. "She's here with us right now. She says she's sorry she never told you how proud she was of everything you accomplished. She was raised by parents who thought praising children would make them lazy, so she didn't know how to say the words you needed to hear." "Carmen," Rosa said gently, "may we come in? There's more." They settled in Carmen's small living room, where framed photographs revealed a woman who'd built a successful career as a social worker, helping other families navigate crisis and trauma. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Carmen had spent her professional life facilitating communication between people who couldn't find their way to understanding, while remaining unable to bridge the gap with her own mother. "Your mother is very sick," Thomas began, using the gentle tone he'd perfected over decades of difficult conversations. "But she's been holding on, waiting for a chance to tell you things she never knew how to say when she was healthy." "I can't watch her die," Carmen said. "I've tried to visit, but every time I walk into that room, all I can think about is how she was never there when I needed her growing up. How work was always more important than I was." Layla looked around the room, her attention caught by something only she could see. "She says she worked 2 jobs to pay for your dance classes, and she came to every recital, even when she had to miss work and lose money." Carmen's face went pale. "She did come to my recitals. I'd forgotten. I was so focused on the time she wasn't there that I forgot about all the time she was. She also says—" Layla paused, her expression growing more serious. "She says there's something important you don't know about your family. Something that might help you understand why she had to work so much." Thomas felt a shift in the room's atmosphere, a sense that they were approaching something significant. Layla's gift had shown him many surprising things about families, but there was something different about her focus now, more intense than usual. "What kind of something?" Carmen asked warily. Layla closed her eyes, and when she opened them, her voice had a quality Thomas had never heard before, older somehow, as if she were channeling someone with decades of life experience. "There was another baby," Layla said quietly, "a brother you never knew about. He died when he was very little, before you were born." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Carmen's grandmother clock. Carmen stared at Layla with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "That's impossible. My mother never mentioned—" "She couldn't talk about it," Layla continued in that strange adult voice. "Losing the baby broke something inside her. She was afraid if she loved you too much, if she got too close, something bad would happen to you too. So she kept herself busy with work, thinking that if she didn't let herself need you too much, you'd be safer." Thomas felt the pieces of a long-buried family tragedy clicking into place. He'd seen this pattern before. Parents who survived the loss of one child by maintaining emotional distance from their surviving children, not understanding that their protective withdrawal was experienced as rejection. "His name was Miguel," Layla said, tears beginning to flow down her young face. "He would have been 2 years older than you. Your mama has his baby blanket in that box under her bed, along with all your pictures." Carmen was crying now, deep sobs that seemed to come from somewhere she'd kept carefully locked away. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" "Because talking about him made the hurt too big to carry," Layla said. "But she's dying now, and she can't take that secret with her. She needs you to know that every time she seemed far away, she was thinking about the child she lost and trying to figure out how to love you without being too scared." Rosa moved to sit beside her sister, offering the kind of quiet support that didn't require words. Thomas remained still, recognizing that they were witnessing something profound, the moment when a lifetime of misunderstanding began to transform into compassion. "There's more," Layla said, wiping her eyes. "She needs to tell you about your father, too, about why he really left." Carmen looked up sharply. "My father left because he didn't want to be tied down with a family. That's what she always told me." "That's what she told you, because the truth was too hard," Layla said. "He left because he couldn't handle losing Miguel. He blamed himself, blamed her, blamed everyone. But before he left, he made her promise never to tell you the real reason, because he didn't want you to think it was your fault." The revelation hit Carmen like a physical blow. Thomas could see her rebuilding her, understanding of her childhood in real time, reinterpreting decades of memories through this new lens of knowledge. "All these years," Carmen whispered, "I thought she chose work over me, but she was just scared." Scared and sad and trying to protect you the only way she knew how, Layla confirmed. She says she knows it wasn't the right way, but it was the only way she could figure out how to keep you safe. Thomas realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in his experience with Layla. The child wasn't just translating messages from the dying. She was revealing family secrets that had been buried for decades, bringing hidden truths to light in service of healing that went far deeper than anyone had imagined possible. "She's waiting for you at the hospital," Layla said, her voice returning to its normal childlike quality. "She has more things to tell you, but she needs to say them to your face, not through me." Carmen stood up, her decision made. "Can we go now? I don't want her to wait any longer." As they prepared to leave, Thomas pulled Rosa aside. "Has Layla ever done anything like that before? Revealed family secrets that no one else knew?" Rosa shook her head. "Never. Usually she just translates simple messages, comfort, love, forgiveness. This was something completely different." Thomas felt Margaret's journal heavy in his pocket, remembering her prediction that Layla's gift would grow stronger and more complex as she learned to trust it. They were venturing into territory none of them understood, guided by a 6-year-old girl whose abilities seemed to be evolving in ways that challenged everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between life and death, between the living and those preparing to leave. But as they drove back to the hospital, Thomas knew one thing with certainty. Whatever Layla's gift was becoming, it was being used in service of love, helping families find their way back to each other across divides that had seemed impossible to bridge. The question was, what other secrets were waiting to be revealed, and whether Thomas was prepared for the truths that might emerge from the mysterious space where grief and healing intersected. Eleanor Martinez died peacefully at 3:47 a.m., holding her daughter's hand and surrounded by the forgiveness that had eluded them both for 40 years. Thomas had stayed through the night, watching Carmen whisper decades of accumulated love and understanding to her mother, finally able to say the words that grief had previously made impossible. But Eleanor's peaceful passing had revealed something troubling about Layla's gift. The child was exhausted in ways that seemed to go beyond ordinary tiredness. After facilitating the profound conversation between Eleanor and Carmen, Layla had collapsed into Rosa's arms, sleeping so deeply that nothing could wake her for nearly 12 hours. "This has never happened before," Rosa confided to Thomas as they sat in the hospital cafeteria the following afternoon. Layla was finally awake but unusually quiet, picking at a sandwich without her typical childlike appetite. "She's always been tired after helping families, but this is different. It's like she gave away part of herself to help Eleanor and Carmen find each other." Thomas studied the little girl, noting the shadows under her eyes and the way she seemed to be listening to conversations only she could hear. "Layla, are there more spirits trying to talk to you now?" She nodded slowly. "Lots more. Ever since yesterday, they're all talking at once. They know I can help their families understand things, so they keep asking me to listen to them." She looked up at Thomas with those serious dark eyes. "It's very loud in my head." The implications worried Thomas deeply. If Layla's abilities were growing stronger, attracting more spiritual communications than she could handle, they needed to find ways to help her manage the gift before it overwhelmed her completely. "We need to set some boundaries," Thomas said, gently. "Maybe we can help you learn to choose which voices to listen to, instead of trying to hear everyone at once." But even as he spoke, Thomas felt a growing urgency about his own situation. The chest pains had worsened overnight, and he'd been unable to hide his discomfort from Rosa's professional assessment. The hospital bracelet she'd found in Layla's possession seemed to be a tangible warning that his own health crisis was approaching rapidly. "Thomas," Rosa said quietly, We need to get you to the emergency room. Now. You're showing all the signs of cardiac distress, and I can't in good conscience let you ignore it any longer. But Margaret, we'll want you to take care of yourself. You know that. Rosa's voice carried the authority of her nursing experience. And Layla needs you healthy if you're going to help her learn to manage her gift responsibly. Reluctantly, Thomas allowed Rosa to drive him to the emergency department, where Dr. Sarah Chen, David's wife and a cardiologist who'd heard about Thomas's work with her son, expedited his evaluation. The tests confirmed what Rosa had suspected. Thomas was experiencing unstable angina, a condition that required immediate intervention to prevent a full heart attack. You need an angioplasty, Dr. Chen explained, as she showed Thomas the results of his cardiac catheterization. 2 of your coronary arteries are severely blocked. We can open them with stents, but it needs to happen today. How long will I be in the hospital? 2 or 3 days, if everything goes smoothly. A week, if there are complications. Dr. Chen studied Thomas's expression with understanding. I know you're worried about your wife, but you can't help her if you're dead. Margaret needs you to be around for whatever comes next. As Thomas was prepared for the cardiac procedure, he felt the weight of all the promises he'd made, to families who needed guidance, to Layla who needed mentoring, to Margaret who needed his daily presence. The timing felt impossible, but Rosa reminded him that healing sometimes required accepting help from others, even when independence felt more comfortable. I'll stay with Layla, Rosa promised as Thomas was wheeled toward the cardiac suite. And I'll make sure someone visits Margaret every day. You focus on getting better so you can come back to both of them. The angioplasty itself was successful, but Thomas's recovery was complicated by an unexpected revelation. As he drifted in and out of consciousness under sedation, he began experiencing something he'd never encountered before. He could hear voices that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. At first, he assumed the voices were hallucinations caused by the medications. But as his awareness sharpened, Thomas realized he was experiencing something similar to Layla's gift. An ability to perceive communications from spirits who were trying to reach their living family members. The first voice he recognized made his heart race with disbelief and longing. Thomas, Margaret's voice was as clear as if she were sitting beside his hospital bed. You can hear me now. He tried to speak, but found himself unable to respond audibly. Instead, his thoughts seemed to reach her directly. Is this real? Are you really here? I'm here the same way I've been here for months, watching over you, trying to help. But your heart attack opened something in you, the same gift that Layla has, just manifesting differently because of your medical training and life experience. Thomas felt a mix of wonder and fear. What does this mean? It means you can help families in ways we never imagined. But Thomas, there are things I need to tell you while we have this connection. Things about what's coming next. As Margaret's spirit communicated with him, Thomas began to understand the larger pattern that had been emerging since the crane accident. His meeting with Layla hadn't been coincidence. It had been orchestrated by a network of spirits who had recognized the potential for unprecedented healing if they could bring together his experience with grieving families and her ability to translate messages from the dying. There's going to be a choice, Margaret's voice continued, carrying a weight that made Thomas's chest tight with more than cardiac distress. The doctors are going to say my body is failing faster now, that the machines are the only thing keeping me alive. They're going to ask you to make decisions about my care. Thomas had been dreading this conversation for months, but hearing it from Margaret herself felt both devastating and strangely relieving. What do you want me to do? I want you to let me go when the time comes. But more than that, I want you to use what we've learned together about love persisting beyond death, about healing happening in ways medical science can't explain, to help other families facing the same choice. "I can't lose you," Thomas whispered, though his lips didn't move. "You're not losing me. You're setting me free to help you in ways I couldn't when I was trapped in that bed. Thomas, our love doesn't end when my body stops working. It transforms into something that can touch more lives than we ever imagined." The conversation was interrupted by the return of Thomas's normal consciousness as the sedation wore off. But the clarity of Margaret's communication remained, along with the devastating knowledge of what lay ahead. Dr. Chen found Thomas awake and alert, his vital signs stable, but his expression troubled in ways that had nothing to do with his cardiac condition. "The procedure went perfectly," she reported. "Your arteries are clear, blood flow is restored, and your heart muscle shows no permanent damage. You should make a full recovery." "How soon can I see my wife?" "Tomorrow, if you're feeling strong." "Enough, but Thomas—" Dr. Chen hesitated, then continued with the careful tone doctors used for difficult conversations. "While you were in surgery, there were some changes in Margaret's condition. Dr. Martinez wants to meet with you tomorrow to discuss her care plan." Thomas felt the conversation with Margaret's spirit taking on new urgency. The choice she'd warned him about was approaching faster than either of them had anticipated. That evening, as Thomas lay in his hospital bed recovering from the angioplasty, Layla appeared in his doorway with Rosa. The child looked more rested than she had in days, and her expression carried a solemnity that seemed far beyond her years. "The lady in yellow says you can hear her now," Layla said without preamble. "She says it's time to help each other with the hardest thing you'll ever have to do." Thomas nodded, understanding that his cardiac crisis had been more than a medical emergency. It had been a spiritual awakening that would change everything about how he understood his purpose in the world. "Are you ready?" Layla asked. Thomas thought about Margaret lying in her hospital bed, about the families who would continue to face impossible choices between hope and acceptance, about the mysterious gift that had brought a 6-year-old girl into his life at the moment when he needed her most. "I'm ready," he said, though he wasn't sure anyone could ever be truly ready for what they were about to face together. The next morning brought the conversation Thomas had been dreading for 3 months. Dr. Martinez, Margaret's neurologist, met with him in a small conference room equipped with tissues and comfortable chairs, the kind of space hospitals designed specifically for life-changing discussions. "Thomas, I need to be direct with you," Dr. Martinez began, spreading Margaret's latest test results across the table. "Margaret's brain function has declined significantly over the past week. The areas that control breathing and circulation are shutting down, and her body is becoming increasingly dependent on the ventilator and other life support measures." Thomas stared at the brain scans, recognizing the dark spaces that indicated tissue death, even though he'd spent his career in general nursing rather than neurology. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that Margaret's body is dying, despite the machines. We can continue the current level of support indefinitely, but there will be no recovery. The question is whether that's what Margaret would have wanted." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out the cassette tape he'd found in Margaret's hidden journal, a recording she'd made in the weeks before her stroke, when she'd apparently sensed what was coming. "Actually, I think I know exactly what she would have wanted." Dr. Martinez looked surprised as Thomas explained about finding Margaret's journal and the tape recording. "She made specific instructions about her care. More than that, she somehow predicted this entire situation, including my meeting Layla and the work we've been doing together." Thomas set the cassette player on the table. "She wanted me to play this for you when the time came to make decisions about her treatment." Margaret's voice filled the small room, clear and determined, despite the evident fatigue that had marked her final weeks of consciousness. "If you're listening to this, Thomas, it means I'm in the hospital and unable to speak for myself. By now, you've probably met the little girl I've been dreaming about, Layla, and you understand that death doesn't end love. It just changes the ways love can express itself. I don't want to be kept alive by machines if there's no hope of meaningful recovery. But more importantly, I want my transition to become a teaching moment for other families facing the same choice. I want you and Layla to help people understand that letting go can be an act of love, not abandonment. Thomas, you've spent your whole career helping families through medical crises. Now I'm asking you to help them through something medicine can't address, the spiritual dimension of death and dying. Use my passing as an example of how love persists beyond physical life. Dr. Martinez listened to the entire recording in respectful silence, occasionally glancing at Thomas as Margaret's words revealed the depth of planning that had gone into this moment. "This is remarkable," Dr. Martinez said when the recording ended. "I've never encountered a patient who provided such clear guidance for their own end-of-life care, especially with such specific instructions about how their death should serve as a learning experience for others." Thomas felt tears burning his eyes, but also a strange sense of peace. Margaret had not only anticipated this conversation, she'd provided him with a roadmap for navigating it with dignity and purpose. "When would this happen?" Thomas asked. "We could begin withdrawing life support as early as tomorrow, if that's your decision. The process typically takes several hours to several days, depending on how the body responds. We can make sure Margaret is completely comfortable throughout." Thomas thought about the hand-knitted blanket Margaret had made years ago for the children. They'd never been able to have, a soft yellow throw that now lay across the foot of her hospital bed. She'd poured so much love into that blanket, creating something beautiful, even though the life it was intended to warm would never exist. Perhaps that was the lesson Margaret was trying to teach him, that love expressed itself through creation and intention, regardless of whether the intended outcome was achieved. The blanket had become a symbol of their devotion to each other, rather than their disappointment about childlessness. "I need to talk to Layla first," Thomas said, "and I want to give Margaret's sister a chance to say goodbye. But yes, I think we should honor Margaret's wishes." Dr. Martinez nodded with understanding. "Take the time you need. When you're ready, we'll make sure everything happens exactly as Margaret wanted." As Thomas left the conference room, he felt the weight of the decision settling around him like a familiar coat, heavy but necessary, painful but right. Margaret had been preparing him for this moment for months, using Layla as a bridge between his rational, medical understanding of death and a deeper spiritual truth about love's persistence. The hardest part wouldn't be letting Margaret go. She'd already shown him that she would remain present in ways that transcended physical life. The hardest part would be living up to her vision of how her death could become a source of healing for other families facing similar choices. But as Thomas walked toward Margaret's room, he realized he wouldn't be facing that challenge alone. Layla would be beside him, translating messages from the dying. Rosa would provide medical support and family advocacy, and Margaret herself would guide them all from whatever realm she inhabited now. The transformation from Thomas Mitchell, retired nurse, to Thomas Mitchell, spiritual counselor for grieving families, was about to be complete. Margaret's final day began with the kind of golden morning light that had always been her favorite, the soft illumination that filtered through the hospital room window and made everything look touched by grace. Thomas had arranged for the withdrawal of life support to begin at noon, giving family and friends time for final goodbyes. Margaret's sister Patricia had driven in from Denver, bringing with her a lifetime of shared memories and the complicated grief that comes with losing the last connection to childhood. David Chen had stopped by with his son Michael, who had awakened from his own coma 3 days earlier and insisted on thanking the woman whose guidance had helped his father find peace during their crisis. But it was Layla who had insisted on being present for Margaret's transition, explaining that Margaret had specifically requested her help in showing other people how to say goodbye with love instead of fear. "She wants me to tell everyone what she's experiencing," Layla had explained to Thomas. "So they can see that dying isn't scary when you're surrounded by people who understand that love doesn't end." Thomas had initially resisted the idea of involving a 6-year-old in such an intimate moment, but Margaret's own wishes, expressed both in her recorded message and through her spiritual communications, had been clear. This was meant to be a teaching experience, and Layla was somehow essential to that purpose. As the medical team began the process of withdrawing life support, Thomas positioned himself on one side of Margaret's bed, while Layla sat carefully on the other side. Rosa stood nearby with her notebook, documenting the experience at Margaret's request, so it could be shared with other families facing similar decisions. "The machines are stopping now," Layla announced softly. "But she says her real self is getting stronger, not weaker." Thomas watched the monitors as Margaret's artificially maintained vital signs began to change, but his attention was focused more on Layla's running commentary than on the medical indicators he understood too well. "She's not in pain," Layla continued, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from beyond her own experience. "She says the feeling is like taking off clothes that were too tight or putting down a heavy suitcase you've been carrying for a long time." Patricia leaned forward, tears streaming down her face. "Can you ask her if she forgives me? We had that fight before her stroke and I never got to apologize." Layla tilted her head in that familiar listening pose. "She says there's nothing to forgive. She says the fight was just two sisters who loved each other too much to let go of being right." The child's expression softened. "She wants you to keep the recipe for her Christmas cookies and make them for your grandchildren every year." Thomas felt Margaret's hand grow cooler in his own, but Layla's descriptions painted a picture of liberation rather than loss. According to the child's translation, Margaret was experiencing her death as a gradual release from physical limitations, a return to a state of pure awareness and love. "She can see all the people who love her," Layla said, her eyes bright with wonder. "Not just the people in this room, but everyone who ever mattered to her. Her parents, her students, her friends who died before her, they're all here waiting to welcome her." Dr. Martinez monitored Margaret's transition with professional attention, but Thomas could see that she too was affected by Layla's descriptions. The clinical process of dying was being transformed into something that felt more like a celebration than a medical emergency. "She wants me to tell you something special," Layla said, looking directly at Thomas. "She says the love you shared doesn't go away when her body stops working. It becomes something bigger, something that can touch more people than it could when it was just between the two of you." Margaret's breathing became shallower, more spaced out, but Layla continued to report on the spiritual dimension of her experience with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a beautiful sunset. "She's ready now," Layla announced quietly. "She says this isn't goodbye. It's just a different way of being together." Thomas squeezed Margaret's hand one final time, whispering words of love and gratitude that felt both final and somehow eternal. Around the bed, everyone held their breath as Margaret's physical life came to its gentle conclusion. But instead of the heavy silence that usually followed death, the room felt filled with something that might have been peace or presence, or the continuation of love in a form that transcended physical existence. "She's free now," Layla said with a smile that transformed her serious little face. "And she says thank you for helping her show everyone that dying can be beautiful when it's done with love." Thomas looked around the room at the faces of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the death of a beloved woman, but a demonstration that love indeed persisted beyond physical life, that healing could happen even in the midst of loss, and that sometimes the most profound teaching occurred not through words, but through the courage to be vulnerable in the presence of mystery. Margaret's transition was complete, but Thomas understood that his real work was just beginning. 6 months later, Thomas Mitchell stood in the same hospital parking lot where a 6-year-old girl had once screamed at him not to get in his car. The construction was long finished, the crane removed, and fresh asphalt covered the space where his sedan had been crushed. But the memory of that moment, the beginning of everything that had transformed his understanding of love, loss, and the mysterious ways healing could happen, remained as vivid as if it had occurred yesterday. He was wearing a new friendship bracelet around his wrist, bright yellow and blue threads woven together by small fingers that had learned to create beauty, even while processing experiences far beyond typical childhood. Layla had made it for him the week before, explaining that yellow was for Margaret and blue was for the peace they'd found together. "Mr. Thomas," Layla's voice called from across the parking lot. She was running toward him with the uninhibited joy of a 7-year-old who had learned to trust her gift as a source of healing rather than fear. Behind her, Rosa walked more slowly, carrying a folder thick with letters from families who had requested their help. "How did the Morrison family session go?" Thomas asked, as Layla reached him, slightly out of breath from her run. The grandfather wanted his son to know he was proud of him, even though they fought about the farm, Layla reported matter-of-factly. And he wanted his grandson to have his fishing rod collection, not because he has to be a fisherman, but because every time he sees them, he'll remember that his grandfather believed he could do anything he set his mind to. Thomas smiled at the child's ability to translate complex family dynamics into simple, healing messages. Over the past 6 months, they had worked with more than 30 families, helping them navigate the delicate space between hope and acceptance, between holding on and letting go. The work had grown beyond what any of them had initially imagined. Word had spread through the medical community about the retired nurse and the gifted child who could facilitate communication between the dying and their loved ones. Families began requesting their services, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles, for sessions that provided closure and peace that traditional grief counseling couldn't achieve. "Dr. Martinez wants to document our methods," Rosa said as she joined them. "She thinks what we're doing could be taught to other healthcare professionals, maybe integrated into hospice programs." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. They had indeed developed a methodology of sorts, combining his decades of experience with grieving families, Rosa's nursing expertise, and Layla's extraordinary gift for spiritual communication. But he knew the real power lay not in any technique they could teach, but in the willingness to remain open to mystery and love in situations where logic and medicine reached their limits. "The most important thing we've learned," Thomas said, "is that healing doesn't always mean curing. Sometimes it means helping people understand that love persists even when life doesn't." They walked toward the hospital entrance, past the memorial garden that had been planted in Eleanor Martinez's honor. Carmen had donated the flowers, bright yellow daisies that bloomed from spring through fall, creating a living reminder that beauty could emerge from the deepest grief. Inside, they were headed to visit their newest client family, a young couple whose infant daughter was in the NICU, fighting for life against overwhelming odds. The situation was heartbreaking in ways that challenged even Thomas's experienced compassion. But Layla had insisted that the baby was communicating important messages to her parents about the love that surrounded her, regardless of her physical outcome. As they rode the elevator to the pediatric floor, Thomas reflected on the changes the past 6 months had brought to all their lives. Layla had learned to manage her gift, setting boundaries around when and how she accessed spiritual communications. Rosa had become an advocate for integrating spiritual care into medical treatment, and Thomas had discovered a purpose that felt more aligned with his deepest values than anything he'd done in 4 decades of nursing. But perhaps the most significant change was in how he understood Margaret's continued presence in his life. She no longer appeared to him in the dramatic ways Layla experienced spiritual communication, but he felt her guidance in quieter moments, in the wisdom that seemed to arise when families needed exactly the right words, in the peace he felt when walking through their garden at home, in the music he'd begun playing again on their piano in the evenings. "Mr. Thomas," Layla said as the elevator doors opened, "Margaret wants me to tell you something." Thomas had learned not to be surprised by these moments when Margaret's spirit found ways to communicate through Layla. "What does she want me to know?" "She says you've learned what she hoped you would learn, that love is the only thing that's really real, and everything else is just details." Layla's expression grew more serious. "And she says there are going to be more families who need us, more people who are lost between staying and going. She wants to know if you're ready to help them." Thomas looked through the hospital windows, at the city beyond, thinking about all the families facing impossible choices, all the people who needed someone to help them understand that love could persist even through the most devastating losses. Margaret's vision had been larger than he'd initially understood, not just about their personal healing, but about creating a new model for how communities could support each other through life's most difficult transitions. "Tell her yes, Thomas," said simply. "Tell her we're ready for whatever comes next." As they walked toward the NICU, Thomas felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and humility that had become his constant companion. Every family brought new challenges, new opportunities to witness the resilience of human love, new reminders that the most important healing often happened in ways that couldn't be measured or documented. But that was exactly what made the work sacred: the willingness to stand in mystery, to trust what felt true, even when it couldn't be proven, and to serve as translators between the world of the living and whatever realms surrounded it with love. Margaret's yellow dress might be folded away in their bedroom closet, but her presence continued to guide them all toward a deeper understanding of how love worked in the world, not ending with death, but transforming into something that could touch more lives than any of them had ever imagined possible.